Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very last review on photosynthesis. I hope that you've all been preparing for the assessment that is coming up. So again, before we do anything else, let's talk about what photosynthesis actually is, and it's putting things together with light. What is the really useful end product that we're going for? It's going to be glucose. And how are we doing that? We're essentially taking the sun's energy, water and carbon dioxide, putting it through a chemical reaction that's going to produce this glucose or this food building blocks that plants need. Remember, there are two types of organisms at the most basic level. Animals are consumers, or heterotrophs, and plants are producers, or autotrophs. In other words, the autotrophs make their own food, glucose, and the heterotrophs consume it. Here's the photosynthetic equation. The top is the unbalanced version, and then underneath is the balanced version. 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters, along with the sun's energy, produce 1 molecule of glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. Here's another way to look at it. Look at the arrows going in, the red carbon dioxide, the yellow sunlight. Look at what's going out, water and oxygen. Look where that water is coming from, right up the stem, and then look at the sugar that's being produced that's going back down the stem. Now, how are plants doing this? They're using different wavelengths of light that are visible to the human eye. This is going to be called the visible spectrum, and it runs from 380 nanometers up to 750 nanometers. Remember, when you look at a plant or a cardinal or the sun or a shirt, the color that that organism is what's being reflected back to your eye. It's that old rhetorical question, why is the sky blue? Well, the sky's blue because that's the wavelength of light that's getting scattered the most, and that's the wavelength of light that comes to your eye. Whatever light you see is the non-absorbed light. This is why most plants are green, because in a moment, you're going to see what chlorophyll does well and poorly. So chlorophyll A and B, these are in almost every single plant in the world. And what happens here is that if you look at the chlorophyll A and B, you can see that chlorophyll B over here and over here is really good at absorbing different wavelengths of light than chlorophyll A. But the wavelengths of light that neither of them do very well are green and a little bit of yellow. This is why plants appear green or greeny yellow. This is why they don't generally appear to be purple, blue, orangey red, because all of those things are being absorbed by the two types of chlorophyll. Now, there are two ways to store energy, glucose and this thing called ADP / ATP. So there are other batteries too, but the main ones are going to be glucose and ATP. So in a minute, we're going to discuss why there are two different types. But essentially what we want to remember is ADP has only 2 phosphate groups. ATP has 3. This is why this is the charged version of the battery and this is the uncharged. Remember, when we're trying to get energy out of ATP, we just break off one of the little phosphate groups. All the rest of it stays the same. And this is why photosynthesis is so efficient. It uses just a tiny bit of the energy out of the ATP to build up a glucose molecule. And that glucose molecule is really good at holding on to that energy long term. So you have glucose, the long-term energy source, and ATP, the quick energy source, so that the plant can just hook this phosphate group back up, recharging the battery where it's ready to use again, instead of having to build this huge complex molecule, which would waste energy and resources that the plant doesn't really have the ability to waste. Here are the other 2 batteries that I promised you. You have NADPH. This is the highly charged battery, and you have NADP plus, the broken battery, very much like you had ATP, the highly charged battery, and ADP, the low charged battery. So again, I'm just going to give you a moment to look at this, and then you'll be able to see the difference between ATP and glucose. Pause the video if you think that you need more time. Okay, we're now going to look at a diagram of photosynthesis. Can you name the two steps in your mind? I hope that you can. Remember, they are the light-dependent reaction, or the light cycle, and the light-independent reaction, or the Calvin cycle. Okay, here is our diagram. And what we want to start to remember is that this diagram is amazing. It shows us lots of things. So up here, remember that photosynthesis is happening here. Oops. Those are our chloroplasts. Note how they're green. And photosynthesis is going to happen, on some membranes and in the liquid portion of this chloroplast. Now, if we were going to block this out, we again want to show the two sides of the photosynthetic cycle. We have the one side, which is going to be the light reaction. And if you notice, there are things that are going into and coming out of this reaction. So notice we have light, we have water, and we have the waste product, O2. But remember, this O2 is going to end up being really important later on because we're going to study heterotrophs, and they, of course, use this O2 as a life-sustaining item. Let's take a look for a moment where the reaction is actually occurring. The light reaction is occurring on the thylakoid membrane. So you can see here, this is your stack of thylakoids. This is your granum. And on every single one of those membranes, each thylakoid, the light cycle is going to be capable of taking place. Now, let's not forget that there's actually some other stuff that's going on in the light cycle. Look what else is going into the light cycle. Don't forget about these dead batteries. They're over here. They're going into the light cycle. Look what's coming out of the light cycle, all of these charged batteries. Now, what's going on the right-hand side? This is going to be the dark cycle, or the Calvin cycle. So notice that there's no light that's going in, but remember, this can happen day or night because light is not needed. So the Calvin cycle doesn't just run at night. It doesn't require darkness. It just doesn't require light to run. So look at the CO2 going in. And yes, finally, our useful product of glucose coming out. And look what else is coming out. Remember those dead batteries that went into the light cycle? Well, how did they get dead? We'll learn about that when we learn about the Calvin cycle. Also, look at where it's taking place. It's taking place inside the liquid portion of the chloroplast. So remember that this is liquid here. And this one, of course, is taking place on that thylakoid membrane. So let's take an even deeper look into this. Firstly, again, remember, look at the membrane. This is very much like your cell's membrane. It's a lipid bilayer, okay? And this entire process is going to be taking place on it. So make sure you know that this is outside. In other words, outside the thylakoid membrane. This is going to then be inside the thylakoid membrane. Remember that these green things are going to be the chloroplasts, and we're going to watch how they take in items like light and how the useful products are being created. So look at the light going in. Look at the light going in and striking the chloroplasts. Then look at the H2O. The H2O is needed. Now, interestingly, what's happening here is that the H2O is actually getting broken apart. It's getting broken apart into those H plus and then the O2. Remember, the O2 is going to end up being our waste product, and these little electrons here are getting carried on the electron transport chain, and that's what's going to eventually enable us to make that ATP that we need. Look at the other things that are going in. You can see that there's the NADP plus and the ADP. Remember, these are our broken batteries. So that light and that H2O that are going in, along with these dead batteries, are going to end up forming charged batteries. So what's coming out? ATP, and even though it doesn't show it, NADPH, oh, yes, it does. I'm sorry, it's down there. It was hiding from me. NADPH, and as well as the waste product. So up here we have waste, the waste product of oxygen. Now remember, when we look at the dark cycle and we go back through and look at that, here's where the charged batteries are coming from. They have used the energy from the electron transport chain to run ATP synthase to make ADP into ATP. And then the electron transport chain is going to use these electrons to make NADP plus into NADPH. Then these guys, of course, I'm just going to put CS here. They're going, or I'm sorry, CC, they're going to the Calvin cycle. So here's the Calvin cycle. Now remember, this is going to have to run multiple times, or it's not going to end up being able to produce that one molecule of glucose. So we're going to basically go through it in the simplest kind of single format. But remember back to that video, this has to run in 6 places to be able to form not just the end product of glucose, but also resetting everything so that this cycle doesn't just produce one molecule of glucose and then what? Just stop? No. It has a self-sustaining mechanism where that starting product that's going to end up going in to the Calvin cycle is always reset so that more and more and more 6-carbon sugars can be produced. All right, so again, what goes in? There is your carbon dioxide and your ATP. What else goes in? NADPH. So again, carbon dioxide and charged batteries are going to go in. ATP goes in twice. Now, what's going to come out? ADP, NADP plus, sugar, the good stuff, right? As well as more ADP. And remember that those ADPs and NADP pluses are going to go back to the light cycle. So again, this sugar, this is our bonus. This is what's going on the product side of the photosynthetic equation, our desired outcome. But these guys here, the ones I'm putting little X's next to, they're really important. I know that they're broken batteries, but that doesn't matter because they're going to go and get recharged up by the sun's energy. Okay, here is another way to picture photosynthesis. And so basically it's taking all of that stuff that we looked at on the last slide and it's saying, okay, let's kind of put it all together in one place. So photosynthesis includes the light-dependent reaction, as well as the light-independent or the Calvin cycle. So the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent or Calvin cycle. The light-dependent reaction takes place on the thylakoid membrane. It uses energy, sunlight, and water to produce ATP, NADPH, and the waste product of oxygen. Remember that the thylakoid membrane is, of course, inside the chloroplast. The Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma, okay? The stroma of the chloroplast, of course. It uses that ATP and NADPH that comes from the light reaction. And what does it produce? High energy sugars. Now, photosynthesis doesn't always work as well as it would like. Sometimes there are issues with photosynthesis, and the issues with photosynthesis come because certain factors, of course, are not always going to be present in the environment. So for example, remember that photosynthetic equation, if there's not water there, or if there's not enough water there, photosynthesis can't run. If the temperatures are not ideal, now obviously ideal temperature is very plant dependent, but just remember that there is supposed to be an idealized temperature. Light intensity, in other words, how much sunlight is there? Size of leaves, are the leaves big enough or able enough to collect that solar energy? And then CO2, remember, if there's no CO2, then photosynthesis can't occur, and thus it would come to a halt. There, of course, are other ones. Maybe you can think of some other things that would change the way a plant could photosynthesize. Like, what about the color of the light? What wavelengths are actually getting there? Would that make a difference? It probably would. Here are some graphs that are going to allow you to look at those previous ones. The most common way that plants react is going to be some is good. There is definitely a point in which it's best, but then more does not make a great difference. Most of them end up like this. You can see this is light intensity. I'm sorry the carbon dioxide got a little cut off there. This would also be things like leaf size, amount of water, all of that. Temperature, on the other hand, is a little different. Too little is bad, too much is bad, but there's a sweet spot in the middle. It's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Small bed, big bed, medium bed. All right, I hope that you will review for photosynthesis, and good luck.